Is Ashes of Creation overly complicated, and is it simply going to be too ambitious? That's the question for today's video, so let's jump right in. So I was watching the latest Q&A with some absolute legendary content creators and Stephen Sharif himself, and some of the answers, if I'm honest, I sort of found myself tuning out a little bit. And it's not because the answers weren't interesting, it's because they were a little bit more complicated than what I could understand at that very moment. Even right now, as somebody who follows this game quite a bit, there's still a lot of this game that I just don't know enough about. I'm pretty sure that there are some other content creators who literally know the Ashes of Creation wiki like the back of their hand. Unfortunately, that's not me. But what I think this does put me in a position to talk about is whether or not it's just too complicated for the average person. Now, the thing is with this, I'm very much aware that this might not matter, because once the game gets into people's hands, then it'll become a lot more obvious what the game actually is. Right now, we actually go through different iterations of a specific subject or topic. It might be that Stephen said something 7 years ago that has now changed, and keeping up with those iterations, obviously your average person will not have to do that. But the game, I do think, has quite a lot of features and quite a lot of complicated features. And the one that really triggered me to make this video was when Stephen was talking about the guild system. How the guilds are going to have like a specific number of perks that they can allocate, and then within the guild there's going to be different groups that all have like different sets of perks. And do you know what? I was like, that is a complicated system. That sounds really good, but are we at risk of bloating the game to be a point where most people won't understand it? I think ultimately the answer will be no, but there's just so much going on with Ashes of Creation. You know, even the class system with its 64 classes, we'll talk more about that in a minute maybe. You've got the different races, which, to be fair, are mostly standardized races. They just have funky names, but that makes sense. Sort of funny to me how the races have good names, but then in the classes we have tank. Just going to keep mentioning that. I think the tank is a stupid name. Then there's going to be different sets of skills and skill trees. There's going to be your class skills, the weapon skills, and then the generic skills, and probably more than that I don't know about right now. In the world itself, we're going to have the node system, which, let's face it, sounds quite like it's going to be quite complicated and maybe a little bit overly ambitious. That's going to change depending on the kind of race of the people who do the quests and all this kind of jazz. You've got massive economy situations where resources are going to matter in certain areas and won't be available in different areas, and there'll be people transporting between the two. You've got the artisan professions. That sounds like a complicated but also deep system with processing, crafting, etc. You're going to have quests, you're going to have the town boss that lead into story arcs. There's naval combat planned at some point. You've got world bosses, you've got monster coins. People are going to be able to own shops and inns. You've got the guild system, the freehold system, the dungeons and raids that scale with the number of people involved. To be honest with you, there's so much that I could go on about talking about how complicated the game is that, you know, it would make this video too complicated and it wouldn't really get the message across that I'm trying to get across. Now, I sort of alluded to something there. I said that one of the systems was deep, and actually we're hoping that that's the case. What we don't want, and that's the whole main point of this subject, I guess, what we don't want is complication for complication's sake. What we want is complication because it brings depth to your playing experience. The guild system, for example, whilst it will add a little bit of a complication to a standard guild system, it does sound like it will make it a rich, deep, more meaningful experience, and perhaps create a little bit of more joy and entertainment from that. It's possible that a lot of these systems won't quite be as complicated as they seem. For example, the 64 classes, that sort of, I think, is not real 64 classes. Somebody's going to argue with me on this one, but basically it's going to be 8 classes, and then each of those 8 classes can pick a secondary archetype, which I assume will have relatively standardized changes that will affect whatever class you are. For example, if you pick tank as a secondary, maybe it will just give you a taunt, but you won't have enough taunts to actually be a primary tank, and they're just going to give that to everybody who picks secondary. Sure, there'll be some unique situations, I imagine, but in general, that sounds complicated, but actually in a gameplay experience, it might be sort of easy to understand. And it might be the case that happens with everything that seems complicated. The freehold system, player ins, all this kind of jazz. I think when Stephen communicates, he's got a little bit of an issue, and that is he's speaking to the hardcore audience, the people who know the game inside and out. There is then a sort of middle ground of the casual people who aren't really following the game, but who will see bits and bobs of it. That'll really happen when we get to Alpha 2. Alpha 2 will have a lot of eyes on the game, and it'll basically fall, I think, on content creators to set expectations, which is what Stephen was talking about just a couple of weeks ago. And it will fall to content creators to explain the features in a way that makes sense for the majority. At the minute, people who are following Ashes of Creation on YouTube are pretty much the people who know a lot about the game. There's a very, very, very good chance that you watching this video right now know more about the game than I do. When the game releases, that probably won't be the case because the audience will sort of be a bit more casual because there'll be more of them. And hopefully at that point, I've actually learned something and it's not just been information going over my head. I do think that complication is a very real worry for Ashes of Creation. What Steven and the team might do in search of the deep, meaningful kind of content, they might go a little bit too far and make some stuff not user-friendly because the game is aimed at a more hardcore player base. But there's only so much people will tolerate with that, so we'll have to wait and see when we see Alpha 2, and obviously when we see launch in however many years that's going to be. Now, the other side of this topic is the game overly ambitious? There's a lot of people who talk about scope creep when you talk about Ashes of Creation, and I sort of like what Steven said here. We don't have a lot of scope creep because the game's scope is already massive. And you know what? It's hard to disagree with that. Most of the game's features were planned from the start. Nothing really massive has changed. I mean, there have been changes, obviously, but there's not been like many new massive areas of content that have been decided to be added rather than what was agreed at the start. Of course, there have been changes though, but that doesn't mean that they'll get away with the idea of over ambition. As I mentioned, all these features that have all these complications, it's very possible that a new development team that, let's face it, Intrepid Studios is, simply can't achieve a quality level that will satisfy the players with all of the features that they are planning on implementing. But the one thing that makes me think it's not too ambitious is the fact that it seems like this Alpha 2 is going to have most of the features that are sort of needed for the game. Like, it's going to have a basic version of the node system. It's going to have 6 out of the 8 classes. Yes, it won't have the secondary class, but you know, they're getting there. It's going to have weapon trees, skill trees, all that kind of jazz. It'll have combat, it'll have stories, it'll have quests, it'll have like some kind of trading, I assume. It's going to have a lot of things, and I think once you've got those in place, then that's the game really. Adding content, I think, will be a lot easier for them over time once they've got the core systems that are all working together. Now, some of these systems are quite ambitious, not just in terms of its technical ability, but in terms of how realistic it will be. For example, with the PvP, we keep talking about this because, you know, it's a thing that I always like to talk about. The PvP corruption system is all going to be how balanced it is, which will determine who plays the game. Can it be finely balanced so that the PvPers like it and the non-PvPers like it? And there's a lot of systems like that in Ashes of Creation that are going to need fine balancing. So it's not just ambition in terms of features, it's ambition in terms of how well they can actually accurately get some of these features balanced together. That's probably going to be the most important thing. It might be that they're giving themselves plenty of time to get all of this stuff finely tuned. It might be that they can get to the point where it all works together once, but the minute they add something else into the mix, everything will come tumbling down like a house of cards. The thing that would make people say, is the game overly ambitious, is simply how long is the development taking? It's very likely at this point in my eyes that the game will have spent over 10 years in development. If that's not a potential sign of being overly ambitious, then I'm not sure what would be. I still think that they can do this. It's going to take them a while. There'll be hurdles along the way. I'm pretty sure they will not get everything right. There will be times where there is some negative PR, but in the main, I'm still hopeful that we all get a game that we want. There's no reason to bet against them, so let's just hope and keep our fingers crossed. Is the game complicated now? Yes, but it might be simpler once we can actually get our hands on it. And is the game ambitious? Yes, but sometimes you got to shoot for the stars, and maybe you'll land on the moon. I don't know who said that. It's cheesy, I know. It is what it is. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to give a big shout out to my Patreons. You guys really help me. That is the best way to support me if you want to do that. And come and follow me over on Twitch. Whilst I do stream New World, I'm going to start a little bit of variety before Ashes of Creation arrives, in which case I'll be doing Ashes of Creation. But come and give me a follow over on Twitch. For now, have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.